11th of May, 1938, late afternoon, at the American Embassy residence in Prince's Gate, London. In a high-ceilinged drawing room, washed with pale spring light, Rosemary Kennedy smooths the fingers of her long white gloves one by one. Outside, carriage wheels echo faintly over wet stone. Inside, the only sounds are the rustle of silk skirts and the soft scratch of a pen on embossed embassy stationery as her mother corrects a draft of a thank-you note. In a British Pathé newsreel shot that day, she appears in a white gown beside her mother Rose and sister Kathleen, preparing to be presented at court to King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. Rose's diary and the society columns will record the evening as a triumph of diplomacy and charm. Rosemary's own diary will list it simply among opera outings and dress fittings. She lowers her head, practicing the deep curtsy again. The gloves are perfect, the smile rehearsed. Only the pressure of her grip on the chair back suggests how much is being held in place and how much cannot be. In early autumn 1918, in the brick house on Beale Street in Brookline, Massachusetts, the Kennedy nursery was already a lesson in expectation. On a cool September morning, as the Spanish influenza epidemic grips Boston and church bells toll for the dead in neighborhoods across the city, Rose Kennedy labors upstairs while the family doctor is delayed somewhere in the chaos of overflowing hospitals and urgent calls. A nurse, following the medical protocols of the era, tells her to keep her legs closed, holding the baby's head in the birth canal for 2 hours. The windows are shut against autumn chill. The room smells of carbolic soap and fresh linens. Rose grips the bedpost, breathing through clenched teeth, while downstairs Joseph paces the front hall, his footsteps muffled by Turkish carpet. Later, medical accounts will suggest that this prolonged oxygen deprivation damaged the newborn's brain, though at the time, no one speaks of such things directly. When Rosemary finally enters the world, she is cleaned, swaddled, and placed in her mother's arms with the brisk efficiency expected of Boston nurses. The birth is recorded in the family Bible in Rose's careful script, Rosemary Kennedy, born September 13, 1918. Nothing in that ink suggests the years of watchfulness and worry that will follow. By the early 1920s, when the household has expanded to include Joseph Jr., John, and soon Kathleen, Joseph and Rose begin to notice that Rosemary is slower to sit, to crawl, to walk than her brothers. She smiles readily, but her speech develops late. Her movements, while sweet-tempered, lack the quick coordination of the other children. Consultations with physicians yield vague reassurances and careful euphemisms. She is a bit delayed, high-strung, in need of special attention. Yet family photographs from Cape Cod summers and Boston holidays show a smiling child in crisp white dresses, her hair ribboned, her posture corrected by an adult hand just outside the frame. She is posed perfectly on sun-warmed beaches, arranged beside siblings in the parlor, always included in the careful architecture of Kennedy family portraits. The gap between public image and private worry opens here, a space that will widen with every passing year. At the dining room table on winter afternoons, with snow muting the sounds of Beale Street outside, Rose sits beside Rosemary and helps her copy short thank-you notes in large, careful letters. It is a ritual Rose insists upon for every child, training in gratitude, in courtesy, in the small social performances that signal breeding and education. For Rosemary, the lessons stretch longer. Rose guides her daughter's hand across the page, forming each letter with patient repetition. Dear Aunt Margaret, thank you for the lovely gift. The sound of the pen against thick paper, the starch of Rosemary's little cuffs brushing the table edge, the low afternoon light slanting through lace curtains, all of it turns a simple exercise into something more deliberate, more weighted. This is training not just in penmanship, but in control, in the performance of competence. The chapter closes on Rose blotting one of Rosemary's uneven notes with firm precision, folding it into an envelope, sealing it with a slight press of her lips, an early sign that in this house, handwriting, like feeling, must be made to look right. The notes will be sent, received, preserved in family archives, speaking, decades later, more gently of Rosemary than the decisions that will one day be made in her name. By the early 1930s, when Rosemary was around 11 and the Kennedy household had grown to include Eunice, Patricia, Robert, and Jean, her difficulties at school had become impossible to hide behind polite phrases and private tutoring sessions. She struggles with reading and arithmetic. Her handwriting, despite years of practice, remains labored and childlike. More troubling to Rose and Joseph are the reports of frustration, tantrums when lessons grow too difficult, tears when she cannot keep pace with her siblings. Tutors come and go, each arriving with new methods and departing after a few months with carefully worded letters explaining that Rosemary would benefit from a more specialized environment. Finally, she is sent to a Pennsylvania boarding school for children with intellectual disabilities, a decision the family does not discuss in letters or at dinner tables where guests might be present. Later, seeking a setting that combines structure with religious oversight, the Kennedys enroll Rosemary at the Convent of the Sacred Heart in Elmhurst, Providence, Rhode Island. The Gothic stone building sits on a hillside overlooking the city, its chapel bells marking the hours in a rhythm meant to bring order to unruly lives. Here, among other girls whose families have chosen discretion over public schooling, Rosemary finds a kind of stability. At Sacred Heart, 2 nuns and a special teacher named Miss Newton work with her all day in a separate classroom away from the main student body. The room is small and plain, its tall windows admitting northern light that makes the white plaster walls seem almost luminous. A crucifix hangs above the blackboard. A globe sits on Miss Newton's desk beside stacks of primers and copybooks. The Kennedys, in a gesture both generous and strategic, donated funds for a new tennis court, a contribution noted in the convent's records and whispered about among the sisters as evidence of the family's gratitude and, implicitly, their prominence. On warm afternoons, the sound of tennis balls striking clay drifts through the open windows of Rosemary's classroom, a reminder of normalcy just beyond her reach. In her exercise books, carefully preserved in family archives, Rosemary practices reading simple sentences, spelling lists of common words, and the proper forms of social correspondence. Her skills, as assessed by Miss Newton in reports to Rose, hover around a 4th grade level. She can read uncomplicated texts, write brief letters following a model, perform basic arithmetic with guidance. What she cannot do, and what becomes increasingly clear with each passing term, is advanced much beyond this plateau. Every afternoon, the convent bell tolls for study hour. The corridors empty. The building settles into concentrated silence. The room smells of chalk dust and floor polish, of wool uniforms and the faint incense that clings to everything in a place where daily mass is non-negotiable. Outside, girls in white blouses and navy skirts volley on the donated court, their laughter floating up through spring air. Inside, Rosemary bends over her copybook, her tongue pressed between her teeth in concentration, forming letters with the slow deliberation of someone for whom each word is effortful. She copies model thank you letters to imaginary hostesses, learning phrases of polite gratitude long before she can fully grasp their social subtext, the invisible hierarchies they reinforce, the performances they demand. Dear Mrs. Winthrop, I am most grateful for your kind hospitality. The formulas are absorbed through repetition, becoming reflexive, even when comprehension lags. The narrator notes that, in elite families of this period, writing gracious notes was not merely etiquette but a core element of feminine training, a small, constant exercise in self-erasure and composure. Girls learn to express thanks without presumption, pleasure without excess, needs without imposition. For Rosemary, these lessons carry an added burden. They must compensate for what she cannot easily convey in spontaneous conversation, and must stand as proof that she has been successfully finished despite her limitations. Her penmanship improves under Miss Newton's patient corrections. Understanding and the patience of those around her are slower to follow. The nuns are kind but firm. The other students mostly ignore her. The tennis court remains the family's most visible contribution to the place that is teaching their daughter how to pass. In early 1938, when Joseph P. Kennedy was appointed United States Ambassador to the Court of St. James's, a position signaling his arrival among the American political elite and the culmination of years spent building wealth and influence, Rosemary traveled with the family across the Atlantic to London. She is 19 years old, no longer a child, but not quite prepared for the adult world into which she is about to be thrust. The embassy residence at Prince's Gate becomes an elaborate stage where American wealth and Irish Catholic ambition must appear effortlessly amid the rigid protocols of British aristocratic society. The house is grand, high ceilings adorned with plasterwork, drawing rooms furnished with Chippendale and damask, windows overlooking carefully manicured private gardens. Footmen in livery move silently through halls, silver gleams on sideboards, fresh flowers arrive daily from Covent Garden. Rose immediately undertakes Rosemary's social education with renewed intensity. There are dress fittings at Mayfair couturiers, lessons in how to navigate the complicated calculus of calling cards and at-homes, instructions on which fork to use at formal dinners, and how deeply to curtsy depending on rank. Every detail is rehearsed, corrected, rehearsed again. For daily education, Rosemary is enrolled in a convent school in London that employs a Montessori program, a progressive educational approach emphasizing hands-on learning, sensory materials, and individualized pacing. The method, developed by Maria Montessori for children with developmental differences and later adapted for mainstream education, suits Rosemary unusually well. Teachers at the school note in their records that she thrives with clear routines and gentle methods, that she responds well to concrete tasks and visible structure. In a classroom with wooden counting beads, textured letterboards, and a daily schedule marked by picture cards, she finds a kind of stability she has rarely experienced in more traditional academic settings. The nuns are neither condescending nor impatient. They assess her abilities accurately and work within them. Yet the greatest test facing Rosemary in London is not academic but social. In May 1938, Rose decided that her two eldest daughters, Kathleen and Rosemary, will be presented at court to King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, a ritual that marks a young woman's formal entry into society and, for Americans, serves as a powerful symbol of transatlantic acceptance. The presentation requires elaborate preparation. Rosemary must learn the specific curtsy demanded by royal protocol, a deep, controlled descent and rise that requires balance, strength, and precise timing. For weeks, she practices in the embassy drawing room under Rose's watchful eye, her movements corrected again and again until they approach the required grace. On the evening of 11 May 1938, Rosemary is dressed in a white satin gown with a regulation train, long white gloves buttoned to the elbow, and 3 white Prince of Wales feathers arranged in her hair, the mandatory costume for debutantes at the Court of St. James's. The dress is heavy, the train cumbersome. The feathers bob with every movement of her head. In the mirror, she looks like every other young woman being presented that season. Polished, poised, indistinguishable. At Buckingham Palace, she waits in a crowded anteroom with dozens of other debutantes and their mothers, the air thick with perfume and nervous chatter. When her name is called, she walks forward across polished marble, her train held by an attendant, the eyes of the assembled court upon her. She curtsies before the king and queen. In that crucial moment, documented in multiple accounts, she stumbles and nearly falls, a breach of protocol that causes Rose's heart to seize and threatens to undo months of preparation. But King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, whether out of kindness or practiced discretion, smile gently. The crowd remains silent. The moment passes without scandal. Rose will later record the evening in her diary as a triumph, emphasizing Rosemary's poise and omitting the stumble. That night, back at Prince's Gate, Rosemary sits at the writing desk in her bedroom and records the event in her own diary. Her entry is brief and factual, listing the presentation among other social engagements, tea dances, dress fittings, a visit to the opera. There is no analysis, no emotional reflection, just a catalog of events, each given equal weight. Later, when embassy photographers arrange the family for official portraits and British Pathé newsreel cameras capture the Kennedy daughters in their court finery, Rosemary will be frozen in white satin and long gloves, her posture perfect, her expression composed. The images suggest complete success, a flawless integration into the highest circles of British society. In public, the court presentation proves she can be presented, can be dressed and rehearsed and guided through the most demanding social rituals of her class. In private, it deepens the family's resolve to manage every step that follows, to never again risk the unscripted moment when she might stumble. By the late 1930s, Rosemary's diaries, fragments of which survive in the Kennedy family archives and have been quoted in multiple biographies, describe a life composed almost entirely of social performances, opera outings, tea dances, luncheons, dress fittings, and visits to dignitaries, including the White House. It is a carefully curated education in the art of being seen, of moving through elite spaces with apparent ease. On one spring day in 1937, before the family's departure for London, her diary records went to a dance in the evening. I wore my new pink dress. I had a wonderful time. The entry is characteristic of her writing style, simple, enthusiastic, focused on external details rather than internal states. There is no mention of whom she danced with, what was discussed, whether she felt anxious or confident, just the dress, the event, the categorical assessment. Wonderful. Rose, intensely aware of how Rosemary's differences might be perceived, arranges for her son John, then a Harvard undergraduate home on holiday, to escort his sister to a tea dance at a Boston hotel so that she appears, in Rose's words, not different at all. The strategy is deliberate, a handsome, socially adept brother lending legitimacy to a sister who might otherwise be overlooked or, worse, pitied. At the dance, held in a ballroom with crystal chandeliers and tall windows overlooking the public garden, the band plays foxtrots and waltzes. The polished parquet floor reflects patent leather shoes and the rustling hems of taffeta and silk dresses. Young women in pastel gowns cluster near the refreshment tables. Young men in dark suits lean against marble columns, assessing potential partners with practiced casualness. John, following his mother's instructions, dances with Rosemary first, leading her confidently through a simple foxtrot. She follows his lead with careful attention, her steps a half-beat slow but adequate. Between dances, they sit together on the edge of a gilt chair, upholstered in pale blue damask, and Rosemary carefully copies names into her dance card when other young men, friends of John's, doing him a favor, come to claim a dance. She presses the small pencil attached to the card by a silk cord, writing each name with the deliberate concentration she brings to all writing tasks. The pencil presses a little too hard into the thick paper, leaving indentations. Later, at home, she will copy those names into her diary, preserving the evidence that she danced, that she was included, that the afternoon passed without incident. That same evening, sitting at her writing desk with a china lamp casting warm light over embossed stationery, Rosemary composes brief thank you notes to the hostess and to several of the young men who danced with her. She copies standard phrases from a model Rose has marked in pencil on a separate sheet. Thank you so much for a delightful afternoon. I greatly enjoyed our conversation. I hope we may meet again soon. The phrases are not her own, but she has learned to deploy them correctly. Grace is becoming a script she can follow, even if she did not write it and does not always fully understand the social calculus it encodes. Gratitude as obligation, pleasure as performance, every interaction a small negotiation of status and expectation. The narrator observes that for young women of Rosemary's class and era, such scripts were universal. All well-bred girls learned to write charming notes that revealed nothing, to express enthusiasm without specificity, to perform delight on demand. What made Rosemary's situation different was only a matter of degree. Where other girls internalized these performances until they became second nature, she had to consciously construct them every time from external models. In her diaries and letters from this period, Preserved in archives and quoted by biographers, there is a recurring quality of earnest documentation. She lists events: went to the ballet, had tea with mother and Kick, tried on 3 new dresses, with the enthusiasm of someone for whom each outing represents achievement, proof of successful participation in a world that might easily exclude her. What the diaries do not record are the moments of frustration when a conversation moved too quickly for her to follow, the time she smiled and nodded without understanding, the exhaustion of constant vigilance. Those absences speak as loudly as the words she did write, on paper, in photographs, in the carefully managed narratives her mother shares with society columnists. Rosemary seems to move easily through this world of teas and dances and opera boxes. She appears in group portraits at embassy receptions. She writes thank you notes on schedule. She curtsies at the right moments. The surface is flawless. Off the page, however, the gaps are beginning to widen. Teachers at her London convent school note that she is restless, easily distracted, that she sometimes loses her temper when frustrated. Rose responds by intensifying the structure, adding more lessons, more practice, more rehearsal. The assumption is that any problem can be solved through sufficient discipline and repetition, that if Rosemary just tries harder, if the family just manages more carefully, the performance can be sustained indefinitely. Across the Atlantic, in the same years that Rosemary Kennedy is learning to curtsy and write thank you notes, institutions like Miss Porter's School in Farmington, Connecticut, and a network of European finishing schools are teaching similar lessons to the daughters of America's wealthiest families. These schools exist to transform girls into women who can serve as ornaments and ambassadors for their family's social ambitions. At Miss Porter's, established in 1843 and still operating as one of America's most prestigious girls' boarding schools, the curriculum balances traditional academics with explicit training in deportment, conversation, and what the school catalog describes as the social graces essential to a lady of refinement. Girls study French and Latin, practice piano and watercolor painting, learn to arrange flowers, and preside over tea services with the seriousness accorded to any other discipline. European finishing schools, particularly those in Switzerland and France, take this training even further. Young American women are sent abroad for a year or two to perfect their French or Italian, to study art history in Florentine museums, to learn the subtleties of continental etiquette. The schools are small, exclusive, expensive. Their purpose, stated openly in promotional materials preserved in archives, is to prepare students to be good wives and mothers, with the polished social skills necessary to manage households, host diplomatic gatherings, and represent their husbands in public life. The underlying philosophy is consistent across all these institutions. A woman's value lies in her ability to facilitate her family's social and political advancement through flawless performance of femininity. Education is not meant to foster independent thought, but to calibrate behavior, to teach girls exactly how deeply to curtsy depending on rank, which fork to use with which course, how to write letters that convey warmth without presumption and intelligence without threatening male authority. Rosemary's own educational path, a succession of convent schools employing Montessori methods, private tutors hired and dismissed with regularity, and intensive training in etiquette that far exceeds what her sisters receive, mirrors this broader culture of feminine social engineering, adjusted for her particular learning differences. In London, in 1938, during the family's time at the embassy, her daily schedule combined formal academic lessons with elaborate rehearsals in posture, conversation, and letter writing. A typical day, reconstructed from family correspondence and school records, might include morning mass at the convent chapel, an hour of reading instruction using Montessori materials, a mid-morning walk in supervised silence, luncheon with instruction in table manners, an afternoon devoted entirely to social training, an evening family dinner where she is expected to report pleasantly on her day without revealing any difficulty or distress. The social training is meticulous. Teachers correct not only her grammar but her tone, not too effusive, not too plain. They model appropriate levels of enthusiasm for different occasions, greater warmth in thanking a close friend's mother, more formal courtesy in acknowledging a dignitary's hospitality. they teach her to recognize social cues that other girls absorb unconsciously, when to speak and when to listen, how to gracefully exit a conversation that has grown too complex to follow, how to deflect personal questions with pleasant vagueness. The physical environment of these lessons becomes part of their meaning. Chalk dust hangs in afternoon light streaming through tall windows. The stiffness of her corseted bodice, mandatory foundation garment for any properly dressed young lady, restricts her breathing and reminds her constantly to sit straight. Watery London light filtered through lace curtains lends everything a slightly dreamlike quality, as if the whole performance is taking place underwater. Every correctly formed sentence in a thank you letter is praised as progress. Rose, receiving reports from teachers, notes each small achievement in her own diary. Rosemary's handwriting much improved. Rosemary remembered all her thank you notes this week. Rosemary made a favorable impression at Mrs. Pemberton's tea. Yet the narrator observes that progress is measured less in what Rosemary understands than in how convincingly she can reproduce the expected forms. Can she write a grammatically correct thank you note? Yes. Does she grasp the complex web of social obligation and reciprocal advantage that the note represents? Unclear. Can she execute a proper curtsy? Yes, with practice. Does she understand the historical and political significance of being presented at the British court? Perhaps not entirely. The better she performs refinement, the harder it becomes for anyone, including Rosemary herself, to say when she is struggling. The very skills meant to help her navigate social situations also serve to mask genuine distress, confusion, or exhaustion. She has been so thoroughly trained to smile, to thank, to appear pleased that the performance becomes indistinguishable from the person, even to those who love her most. By late 1938, Rose writes in her diary that Rosemary is doing beautifully in London. The statement is both true and false. True in that Rosemary has learned to move through embassy receptions without obvious error. False in that the effort required to maintain this performance is beginning to exact a cost no one has yet calculated. In early 1939, as Europe moved inexorably toward war and diplomats across the continent watched the German annexation of Czechoslovakia with growing alarm, the Kennedy family traveled to Rome for the coronation of Pope Pius V. For a prominent Irish Catholic American family, the event is both a profound religious experience and an unparalleled opportunity for social and political positioning. The journey itself is elaborate. The family travels by rail from London across France, through the Swiss Alps, where snow still covers the mountains in early March, and down into Italy, where spring arrives earlier and the light turns golden. Rosemary records fragments of the journey in her diary, the names of cities where they stop, the hotels where they stay, brief notes about churches and meals. In Rome, they are given places of honor at the coronation ceremony in St. Peter's Basilica. The event is spectacular. Thousands of people packed into the vast church, cardinals in scarlet robes processing through incense-thick air. The new pope carried on the sedia gestatoria, the portable throne, while the crowd cheered. Sunlight streams through the great dome, illuminating marble and gold mosaic, casting the whole scene in a kind of celestial glow. For Rosemary, the ceremony is overwhelming in scale and sensory intensity. Vatican bells echo across the crowded square where pilgrims have gathered since before dawn. Inside the basilica, incense hangs in the air, making it hard to breathe in the crush of people. Her formal clothes, long-sleeved dress, gloves, hat, the corseted undergarments required for respectability, are oppressively heavy in the southern heat. Her gloves stick slightly to her palms as she clasps her missal, the thin pages damp with humidity. The narrator notes that for an American ambassador's daughter, such ceremonies serve multiple purposes. They are genuine religious experiences. The Kennedy family's Catholicism is sincere, even if it is also strategic. But they are also training grounds, stages on which young women like Rosemary learn to perform piety and cultural sophistication simultaneously. Every bow before a cardinal, every whispered greeting in French or Italian, Every moment spent standing motionless during the 3-hour ceremony reinforces lessons learned in convent classrooms and embassy drawing rooms. This is what it means to be a Kennedy, to be a representative of American wealth and Catholic devotion on the European stage. The personal and belief, fatigue, confusion must be subordinated entirely to the public performance. That night in a hotel room, with frescoed ceilings and windows overlooking the Tiber, Rosemary sits at a small writing desk under the dim glow of a table lamp and writes letters home on embassy stationery with the American seal embossed at the top. She describes the ceremony in simple terms. It was beautiful. The Pope wore white and gold. There were many people. Her script neat but childlike, each letter formed with the careful deliberation of someone for whom writing remains effortful. The letters will be sent to relatives in Boston, to the nuns at Sacred Heart, to family friends who have followed the Kennedys' rise with interest and envy. They will be saved, passed around, preserved as evidence of Rosemary's continued social success. No one reading them will know how long it took her to write each sentence, how many times Rose reviewed the drafts and suggested corrections, how much of what she saw and felt remained untranslatable into the acceptable language of grateful piety. Contextually, the narrator explains, such trips placed young women like Rosemary at the intersection of diplomacy, religion, and display. They were visible symbols of their family's values, piety, wealth, cultivation, even as their own inner lives remained largely undocumented, except in the fragmentary, carefully managed prose of diaries and letters. The Roman trip includes other activities beyond the coronation. Tours of ancient ruins guided by professors hired for the purpose, visits to Renaissance churches where Rose instructs her daughters in art history, formal dinners with Italian nobility where Rosemary must navigate multiple languages and elaborate table settings. Each event is another test, another performance, another entry in the catalog of accomplishments that prove she is managing, succeeding, keeping pace. In photographs from Rome, the Kennedy family appears polished and confident. Joseph in a dark suit, Rose elegant in a tailored dress and hat, the children arranged by height, and looking directly at the camera. Rosemary stands among her siblings, her posture correct, her smile in place. Nothing in the image suggests strain or difference. The Kennedys look exactly like what they have worked so hard to become. American aristocracy, comfortable in the corridors of power, equally at ease in London embassies and Vatican ceremonies. But while the world hurtles toward war, Hitler will invade Poland in September. Just 6 months after this Roman interlude, Rosemary's letters and diary entries still speak mostly of dresses in chapels, of formal events attended, and thank you notes written. The larger historical forces gathering momentum around her remain largely absent from her recorded thoughts, either because she does not understand them or because the forms of writing available to her have no room for such complexities. Her world is narrow by design, focused on the immediate and the manageable. The next dress fitting, the next thank you note, the next public appearance where her performance will be judged. By late 1940, with war spreading across Europe and Joseph Kennedy's ambassadorship ending in failure and recrimination after he expressed defeatist views about Britain's chances of survival, the Kennedy family returned to the United States. The return is not triumphant. Joseph's political reputation is damaged. His hopes for higher office are dimmed. The family retreats to their various American homes, Hyannisport, Palm Beach, Bronxville, to regroup and recalibrate their ambitions. Rosemary, now in her early 20s, has reached an age when young women of her class would normally be navigating engagements and preparing for marriage. Instead, she cycles through a succession of institutional placements as her parents search desperately for an environment that can contain behaviors that are becoming increasingly difficult to manage. She spends time at a boarding school in Philadelphia, then at a convent school in Washington, D.C., where the Kennedy family maintains political connections even as Joseph's own influence wanes. Reports from teachers and nuns, preserved in family correspondence cited by biographers, describe her as increasingly irritable and difficult, prone to convulsions, possibly seizures, possibly something else, and sudden rages during which she attempts to strike caregivers. The sources of her distress are not recorded in her own voice. Rosemary's diary entries become more sporadic during this period and eventually cease altogether. What remains are the observations of others: nuns writing to Rose with growing concern, doctors' reports using the limited and often misleading psychiatric vocabulary of the era, Joseph's letters revealing mounting frustration and fear. At the convent school in Washington, a Gothic stone building in a residential neighborhood where the Kennedy family can visit regularly, the nuns discover that Rosemary has been slipping out at night. How she manages this, whether she walks out an unlocked door or climbs from a window, is not specified in the surviving accounts. Where she goes is also unclear. Into the city, toward the sounds and lights of a world beyond convent walls, perhaps simply walking for the sake of movement and freedom. The nuns are terrified. They fear she could be exploited sexually, could become pregnant, could contract a venereal disease, risks that, in a family now intensely focused on the political futures of Joseph Jr. and John, feel absolutely intolerable. The Kennedy family's carefully constructed public image cannot survive the scandal of an intellectually disabled daughter wandering Washington streets at night, vulnerable to anyone with malicious intent. Letters from the convent to Joseph and Rose, quoted in later biographies, speak in the coded language of Catholic institutions addressing wealthy benefactors. They express concern for Rosemary's welfare, note that her needs may exceed what the convent can provide, suggest that specialized care might be more appropriate. The meaning beneath the euphemisms is clear. Take her away before something terrible happens. At night in the convent, Rosemary lies in a narrow bed in a dormitory room with other women, listening to the city sounds beyond the walls, cars passing, distant sirens, the hum of urban life that she is not permitted to join. The bells of the chapel toll the hours, matins at dawn, vespers at dusk, marking time in a rhythm meant to order and contain. The corridors echo with footsteps. The stone floors are cold under her feet when she returns late from her illicit excursions, trying to move silently past the night watchman's station. The desperation that drives her out into the night is nowhere recorded in her own words. Perhaps she cannot articulate it, or perhaps no one asks in a way she can answer. What remains is only behavior. The locked door found open, the missing girl discovered and returned, the escalating panic of those responsible for her safety. During this period, the form of documentation shifts significantly. Where Rosemary once wrote brief diary entries and copied thank you notes, now adults write about her in guarded, anxious language. She has become a subject rather than an author, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be heard. The narrator reflects that the same social skills that once hid her differences, the perfect penmanship, the memorized pleasantries, the careful performance of gratitude and docility, now hide her distress, both from the outside world and, crucially, from those who must decide her fate, because she has been taught so well to smile and thank and appear pleased, because her training in self-erasure has been so thorough, it becomes nearly impossible for her to communicate genuine suffering in any language that her family or caregivers recognize as legitimate. Rose, according to her later diaries, is distraught but defers to Joseph. Joseph, according to multiple biographical accounts, is determined to find a solution, medical, institutional, technological, that will render Rosemary manageable again and will restore her to the baseline of docility and compliance that prevailed during the London years. The question of what Rosemary herself wants, needs, or feels is raised by no one in any surviving document from this period. In a world where her voice has never been considered fully authoritative, where every word she speaks and writes is filtered through adult supervision and correction, her own perspective on her life is simply absent from the record. The performance of grace and refinement that once seemed to solve the problem of her difference now becomes a barrier to understanding the crisis at hand. Behind the carefully maintained surface, something is breaking that no amount of etiquette training can repair. To understand what happens next requires stepping back to examine the broader machinery of social control that elite families like the Kennedys, employed in managing daughters who threatened in any way to disrupt carefully constructed public images. In the early 20th century, for families with sufficient wealth and social ambition, education and etiquette functioned as forms of social engineering as deliberate and calculated as any architecture or business strategy. The goal was to produce young women who could be inserted seamlessly into marriages, philanthropic organizations, campaign stages, diplomatic circles, women whose behavior was so perfectly calibrated that they enhanced rather than endangered family reputation. Finishing schools and convents served as the primary instruments of this calibration. At institutions like Miss Porter's, the Emma Willard School, or any of a dozen European finishing academies, the curriculum focused less on intellectual development than on behavioral modification. Girls learned to modulate their voices, to move gracefully through rooms, to write letters that conveyed exactly the right tone of grateful deference or warm condescension depending on the recipient's social position. The training was comprehensive and unrelenting. Posture was corrected through hours of walking with books balanced on heads. Speech patterns were refined through elocution lessons that eliminated regional accents and class markers. Even spontaneous emotional expression was subject to regulation. Excessive enthusiasm was vulgar. Visible anger was unthinkable. Sadness was to be borne privately with dignity. For most girls, this training was absorbed gradually and became largely unconscious. By the time they emerged from these institutions, they had internalized the rule so thoroughly that performance became identity. They were, in the fullest sense, finished, polished into smooth surfaces that reflected family values without revealing personal depths. For Rosemary Kennedy, however, the process never achieved that seamless internalization. The effort remained visible. The performance never quite became second nature. Teachers' letters to her parents, preserved in family papers and quoted extensively in Kate Clifford Larson's biography, Rosemary, the Hidden Kennedy. Daughter, reveal an ongoing tension between Rosemary's genuine sweetness, a phrase that appears repeatedly, and behaviors that do not fit the expected patterns. Doctors' reports from this era, often maddeningly vague by contemporary standards, describe her as retarded, the accepted medical term of the period, with emotional instability and a difficult temperament. What these assessments miss, or choose not to examine, is the possibility that her difficult behavior might be a rational response to an intolerable situation. Constant surveillance, repeated failure at tasks others find simple, the exhausting effort of performing competence she does not feel. Rose's own diaries, portions of which have been published and analyzed by multiple biographers, reveal her consuming anxiety about Rosemary. She records every small success, a correctly written note, a successful social call, a compliment from a teacher, with the intensity of someone desperately seeking evidence that her daughter can, with sufficient effort and management, be made presentable. Every new school, every new educational approach, every renewed emphasis on practicing penmanship and memorizing social scripts is both a genuine attempt to help Rosemary function in the only world the Kennedys know how to navigate, and a way to postpone harder, more frightening questions. What if no amount of training will produce the desired result? What if Rosemary cannot be successfully finished? What then happens to a daughter who cannot fulfill the only role elite families imagine for women? The historical record shows Joseph and Rose consulting with numerous specialists throughout the 1930s and early 1940s, searching for explanations and solutions. They receive a bewildering array of diagnoses: mild mental retardation, emotional disturbance, childhood trauma, possible epilepsy. The treatments proposed are equally varied: more rigorous academic instruction, more consistent behavioral discipline, dietary changes, hormone therapy, prayer. What unites all these interventions is the underlying assumption that Rosemary is a problem to be solved through correct application of expert knowledge and sufficient parental determination. The possibility that she might be a person with valid needs and desires that conflict with family expectations is never seriously entertained in any surviving document. The narrator observes that in houses where every thank you note must be perfect, where every public appearance is choreographed, where social reputation is defended with the intensity of a military campaign, it becomes very difficult to admit that no polite phrasing will solve what truly frightens you. The same families that excel at managing appearances are often least equipped to confront realities that cannot be managed into an acceptable form. By 1941, Rosemary's nighttime escapes from the Washington convent have convinced Joseph that the situation is untenable and deteriorating. His letters to medical professionals, later obtained by researchers, reveal his primary concerns: preventing pregnancy, avoiding scandal, and ensuring that whatever happens to Rosemary does not damage his son's political futures. The tragedy, apparent only in retrospect, is that the very training in feminine docility and self-erasure that was supposed to protect Rosemary has left her without any effective means of advocating for herself. She has been taught to defer to authority, to accept corrections gracefully, to smile and thank even when distressed. She has never been encouraged to articulate her own needs or to imagine that her desires might be as valid as her family's ambitions. When refinement fails to contain disorder, when the performance cracks and the real person beneath begins to emerge in ways the family finds threatening, those invested in order often look to more drastic tools. For the Kennedys in 1941, that tool will be medicine, specifically a surgical procedure promising to calm difficult personalities and restore manageable compliance. The pen Rosemary once used to practice thank you notes will soon appear in her father's hand, signing consent forms for irreversible surgery. In 1941, Rosemary was 23 years old, the precise age when young women of her class and generation would normally be negotiating engagements, planning weddings, and preparing to assume their places in society as wives and mothers. For the wealthy families who populated Newport cottages and Manhattan penthouses, marriage at this age was not merely expected, but essential, the culmination of all the training in deportment and social grace that began in childhood. Marriage among elite families in this era functioned as a form of strategic alliance, carefully negotiated and elaborately staged. American heiresses had been marrying into European aristocracy since the late 19th century, trading their families' industrial fortunes for ancient titles and social legitimacy. The arrangements were transacted like business mergers. Dowries and settlements were negotiated by lawyers. Marriage contracts specified terms and conditions. Families on both sides assessed the advantages with calculated precision. Consuelo Vanderbilt's 1895 marriage to the Duke of Marlborough, arranged by her mother and finalized despite Consuelo's tears and protests, exemplified this system at its most ruthless. The Vanderbilt millions restored Blenheim Palace. The Duke's title elevated the Vanderbilts into the highest reaches of British aristocracy. That Consuelo was miserable was considered regrettable, but ultimately irrelevant. By the 1940s, such overtly arranged marriages were less common, but the strategic calculation remained. Families still evaluated potential matches based on wealth, social position, political connections, and religious compatibility. Young women were still expected to marry within their class and to understand that personal happiness was secondary to family advantage. For Rosemary Kennedy, however, there is no evidence of any serious suitors. No young men call at the family homes in Hyannisport or Palm Beach. No one asks Joseph for permission to court his eldest daughter. The balls and teas and carefully orchestrated social events that were supposed to lead to appropriate courtship have produced nothing. The reasons are not difficult to discern. Rosemary's intellectual limitations, her need for supervision, her occasional outbursts of temper, all of these make her unmarriageable by the standards of her class. No ambitious young man from a comparable family would choose a wife who requires the level of management Rosemary needs. No parents would bless such a union. In another family, with different values or fewer social pretensions, this might simply mean Rosemary remains unmarried, lives at home or in a comfortable private arrangement, perhaps finds meaningful work or pursues interests suited to her abilities. But the Kennedys are not another family. They are, by 1941, a family consumed by political ambition, with Joseph imagining the presidency for Joseph Jr., or, failing that, for John. The surviving documents from this period, letters, medical consultations, legal arrangements, show Joseph's rising alarm about what Rosemary's presence might mean for those political futures. According to Eunice Kennedy's later recollections, quoted in multiple biographies, Rosemary has become more volatile since the family's return from England. There are rages during which she breaks furniture, attempts to hit caregivers, screams with a fury that cannot be calmed by the usual methods of distraction and appeasement. There are also the nighttime escapes, which terrify Joseph for reasons both protective and political. If Rosemary were to be exploited, to become pregnant, to be found in compromising circumstances, the scandal would be devastating. In an era when a politician's family life is understood as evidence of his moral character, a daughter who cannot be controlled becomes a liability that could end careers before they begin. Joseph begins consulting with psychiatrists and neurologists, searching for a medical solution to what he understands as a medical problem. The idea that Rosemary's distress might be a comprehensible response to an untenable situation, that constant surveillance, repeated failure, and the absence of any meaningful autonomy might legitimately produce rage and desperation, does not appear to enter his thinking, or at least does not appear in any surviving document. Instead, he finds Walter Freeman, a neurologist at George Washington University, who is aggressively promoting a new surgical procedure, the prefrontal lobotomy. Freeman, who will later become infamous for performing thousands of lobotomies, including many on vulnerable patients without proper consent, presents the operation as a modern, scientific solution to mental illness and behavioral disorders. The procedure involves severing connections between the prefrontal cortex and other parts of the brain, based on the theory that emotional disturbances originate in excessive neurological activity that can be literally cut away. Freeman has been performing lobotomies since 1936, learning the technique from Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Moniz, who will win the Nobel Prize in 1949 for developing the procedure, a prize that stands as one of the most controversial in the award's history. Freeman's promotional materials, preserved in medical archives, promise that lobotomy can calm agitated patients, make them more manageable, and eliminate dangerous behaviors. The procedure is described as safe, modern, and humane, far superior to the alternatives of permanent institutionalization or ineffective psychiatric treatment. What Freeman's materials do not emphasize are the risks: profound personality changes, permanent cognitive impairment, loss of emotional capacity, incontinence, seizures, sometimes death. The surgery is irreversible. There is no going back. Correspondence between Freeman and Joseph Kennedy, portions of which have been quoted by biographers, though the complete archive remains restricted, shows Joseph being told that the operation will calm Rosemary's mood swings, eliminate her troubling behaviors, make her more tractable and content. Freeman apparently assures him that the risks are minimal and the benefits substantial. Joseph makes his decision without consulting Rose. She will not learn about the operation until after it is completed, and without, apparently, seeking Rosemary's consent in any meaningful way. Whether she understands what is about to happen to her, whether anyone explains the procedure to her in terms she can comprehend, whether she agrees or protests, none of this is recorded in any document that has become public. The pen she once used for thank you notes, for diary entries listing dances and dress fittings, for copying out model letters under her mother's supervision, is now in her father's hand, signing consent for irreversible surgery on his daughter's brain. In a world trained to believe that problems can be corrected into silence, that medicine offers technological solutions to social difficulties, that parental authority is absolute and children's autonomy barely exists, a procedure promising quiet seems not just acceptable, but appealingly modern and humane. In November 1941, in a surgical theater at a hospital affiliated with George Washington University in Washington, D.C., Rosemary Kennedy is brought in for a prefrontal lobotomy to be performed by Walter Freeman and his surgical partner James Watts. The date is not precisely recorded in public documents, but it is definitely November, the same month that, weeks later, Japanese planes will attack Pearl Harbor and transform American isolation into total war. The operation is scheduled for early morning. The surgical theater is white-tiled, cold, illuminated by harsh overhead lights that eliminate all shadow. Metal instruments gleam on sterile trays. The smell is carbolic, clinical, utterly unlike the drawing rooms and chapels that have framed Rosemary's life until now. Freeman's method, as he describes it in medical papers, and as Watts later recounted in interviews quoted by biographers, involves drilling small holes in the skull on both sides of the head, then inserting a specialized surgical instrument, essentially a modified butter knife, into the brain to sever the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the thalamus. For this particular operation, Rosemary is not given general anesthesia. Instead, she receives only a local anesthetic to numb the scalp. Freeman and Watts have developed a technique they consider innovative. They ask the patient to remain conscious during the procedure so they can monitor the effects in real time and know when to stop cutting. According to Watts's later account, as quoted in Ronald Kessler's The Sins of the Father and other biographies, they ask Rosemary to recite prayers, to sing songs, to count backward, to answer simple questions. She cooperates, her voice echoing in the clinical space, "Our Father, who art in heaven, God bless America, land that I love." The words she has learned by rote, memorized through years of patient instruction, now serve as a measure of how much of her brain the surgeons can destroy before she stops being able to speak. They cut, they ask her to sing. They cut more, they ask her to recite. Her responses grow slower, more confused, her words slurring together. Finally, she stops making coherent sounds altogether, just confused murmurs, then silence. At that point, Freeman and Watts withdraw their instruments, judging that they have cut as much as they safely can. The operation takes approximately an hour. No family members present. Joseph has returned to Hyannisport. Rose does not yet know the surgery is taking place. Outside the hospital, Washington continues its daily business. Bureaucrats walking to government buildings, streetcars clanging along their tracks. The early winter cold settling over the city. Inside, in the surgical theater, the overhead lights illuminate Rosemary's head, the neat bandages covering the holes drilled through her skull. The doctors in their white coats filling out the operation report with clinical precision. When the anesthesia clears and Rosemary regains consciousness, it is immediately apparent that something has gone catastrophically wrong. She cannot speak intelligibly anymore, only confused sounds, fragments of words that make no sense. She cannot control her movements. Her limbs jerk and spasm. Her facial expression is slack, vacant. The woman who yesterday could write thank you notes and curtsy before royalty has been reduced to a mental capacity resembling that of a very young child. Over the following days, as Rosemary fails to improve and the extent of the damage becomes undeniable, the doctors inform Joseph that she will require permanent institutional care. She is incontinent. She cannot walk without assistance. Her speech, if it can be called that, is gibberish. The daughter who once danced at embassy balls now cannot feed herself without help. Rose is told only after the operation is completed and the outcome is clear. The revelation is made either by Joseph himself or by a doctor. Accounts vary. Sometime in late November or early December 1941, as the nation reels from Pearl Harbor and the Kennedy family faces its own private catastrophe. Rose's reaction is not documented in her diary. The entries for this period are either missing from the archives or were never written. What survives is her much later statement, decades afterward, quoted by biographer Kate Clifford Larson from interviews conducted in the 1970s. Joe thought it would help her, but it made her go all the way back. It erased all those years of effort I had put into her. The statement is remarkable for what it reveals and what it omits. Rose's grief is real, but is framed entirely in terms of effort expended and now lost. The countless hours of supervised practice, the patient corrections, the careful management that was supposed to make Rosemary presentable. There is no recorded rage at Joseph for making this decision unilaterally. No documented questioning of the doctors who promised a cure and delivered catastrophe. No public acknowledgement that what has been erased is not primarily Rose's effort, but Rosemary's entire capacity for selfhood. In the immediate aftermath, The family makes arrangements to move Rosemary out of the hospital and into private care where she can be hidden from public view. The decision is made quickly, quietly, with the efficiency the Kennedys bring to all crisis management. The narrator observes that where etiquette and education had once hidden Rosemary's difficulties, making her appear more competent than she felt, covering gaps in understanding with practice scripts, medicine has now obliterated possibility itself. The girl who struggled to learn but did learn, who felt frustration and rage and desire, who slipped out of convents at night seeking some unnamed freedom, has been reduced to a body that requires feeding and cleaning and physical restraint. The lobotomy was performed in the name of helping her, of calming her distress, of making her life more manageable and content. What it actually accomplished was to destroy the person she was, limited though her capacities were, and replace her with someone fundamentally different, profoundly diminished, entirely dependent. Outside the hospital windows, beyond the white-tiled walls and the cold surgical lights, the world is moving toward total war. American boys will soon be dying on Pacific Islands and European battlefields. The Kennedy family will send their sons into service. Joseph Jr. will die in 1944 when his plane explodes over the English Channel. But in November 1941, the first Kennedy casualty of the decade had already occurred in a surgical theater in Washington, D.C., where a young woman was asked to sing while doctors cut into her brain, and stopped singing and never spoke coherently again. After the operation, Rosemary Kennedy is quickly moved out of public view, beginning a process of erasure that will last for 2 decades. The speed and thoroughness of her disappearance from family life demonstrates the Kennedys' efficiency in managing crises that threaten their carefully constructed public image. Initially, she spent several years at Craig House, a private psychiatric hospital in Beacon, New York, overlooking the Hudson River. Craig House is not an ordinary institution. It is an exclusive sanitarium for wealthy patients, known for discretion and comfort. The grounds are landscaped like an estate, with gardens and walking paths. The rooms are furnished elegantly. Patients, or residents, as they are called, are attended by nurses and doctors who understand that privacy and confidentiality are as important as medical care. The costs are substantial, but Joseph Kennedy pays without complaint. What he is purchasing is not merely care, but silence. At Craig House, no journalist will discover Rosemary. No photographer will capture her image. No curious acquaintance will accidentally encounter her and carry tales back to Boston or Washington. Yet even Craig House's discretion is not sufficient for the Kennedys' long-term needs. In 1949, after several years of searching for a more permanent and more distant solution, Joseph arranged for Rosemary to be moved to St. Coletta School for Exceptional Children in Jefferson, Wisconsin, a small town nearly 1,000 miles from the Kennedy homes in Massachusetts, Florida, and New York. St. Coletta, operated by the Franciscan Sisters of Christian Charity, is a Catholic institution founded in 1904 to care for children and adults with intellectual disabilities. Unlike Craig House, it is not exclusive or expensive, though Joseph's substantial donations ensure that Rosemary receives special treatment. With Kennedy funding, the sisters construct a small private residence on the St. Coletta grounds, separated from the main buildings where other residents live in dormitories. The house became known as the Kennedy Cottage, a modest 2-story structure with several bedrooms, a living area, and a small garden enclosed by a fence. Rosemary lives in this cottage with 2 or 3 Franciscan nuns who attend to her constant needs: feeding, bathing, dressing, toileting. The routines are simple and repetitive: meals at regular hours, daily walks around the grounds, weather permitting, with a nun holding her arm to steady her uneven gait, simple craft projects, stringing beads, coloring in large print books that occupy her hands without requiring thought, evening prayers before bed. The cottage is comfortable but isolated. Rosemary's world, once expansive enough to include London embassies and Vatican ceremonies, has contracted to a few rooms and a fenced garden in rural Wisconsin. The bells that mark time are now the Angelus tolling from St. Coletta's chapel, not the chimes of Mayfair or the carriage wheels on London stone. For 2 decades after her placement at St. Coletta, Rose Kennedy never visited, not once. She will later offer various explanations that the doctors advised against visits, that seeing family upset Rosemary, that Rose herself could not bear to witness what her daughter had become. Whatever the reasons, the woman who spent years drilling Rosemary in thank you notes and proper curtsies stays away for 20 years. Joseph Kennedy never visits at all, never in all the years between Rosemary's arrival at St. Coletta in 1949 and his own death in 1969. He pays the bills, makes the necessary arrangements, ensures that the nuns have whatever they need to care for his daughter, but he never makes the journey to see her. The younger Kennedy siblings, Eunice, Patricia, Jean, Robert, Teddy, are told very little about Rosemary's whereabouts or condition. The standard explanation when anyone asks is that Rosemary is living at a school or is reclusive. The implication is that she has chosen this separation, that she is shy or prefers solitude. During John F. Kennedy's Senate campaigns in the 1950s and his presidential campaign in 1960, when journalists compile family profiles and photographers arrange group portraits, Rosemary is simply absent. Press releases list the Kennedy children but omit her or dismiss her with a single vague sentence. In a photograph that will become iconic, the Kennedy family posed at Hyannis Port, handsome and vigorous and laughing. There is an empty space where Rosemary should be. The narrator observes that inside the Kennedy cottage in Jefferson, Wisconsin, the rhythms of elite life, the seasonal migrations between Hyannis and Palm Beach, the campaign stops and embassy receptions, the balls and teas that once structured Rosemary's existence have been replaced entirely by institutional routines. Mealtimes are announced by bells, walks are supervised by nuns. The only crafts are those simple enough for damaged hands to manage. Photographs from the period, taken by the St. Coletta sisters and preserved in the institution's archives, show a woman in middle age with a gentle, somewhat vacant expression. Her dark hair, once carefully styled for embassy photographs, is cut short and simple. Her clothes are plain dresses in dark colors. One arm hangs at an awkward angle, slightly palsied from the brain damage. Her gait when she walks is unsteady, one leg dragging slightly. But the photographs also show moments of apparent contentment. Rosemary sitting in a garden chair in summer sunshine. Rosemary at a table working on a simple puzzle. Rosemary with one of the nuns, both of them smiling. The sisters at St. Coletta speak fondly of her in later interviews, describing her as sweet-tempered, affectionate, childlike in her enthusiasm. Occasionally, staff help her hold a pencil to write her name on a greeting card at Christmas or for a family birthday. The letters are large, uneven, shaky, requiring several attempts before they are legible enough to send. They are a distant echo of those long-ago thank-you notes copied out under Rose's supervision, but now stripped of social purpose, reduced to the simple mechanical act of forming letters. The family that once curated every public impression with obsessive care, that managed every photograph, and interview and society column mention, has succeeded in making its most fragile member nearly invisible. Rosemary is hidden not merely from the public, but from the family's own narrative about itself, erased as thoroughly as the brain surgery erased her capacity for independent thought. For the nuns at St. Coletta, she is simply Rose, a gentle resident who needs help with everything but responds to kindness with smiles. For the Kennedy family, when they think of her at all, she is an unfortunate memory, a reminder of what can go wrong when ambition collides with human limitation. In Jefferson, Wisconsin, far from the centers of power where her brothers are making history, Rosemary Kennedy lives in permanent childhood, waited on by nuns, her days marked only by bells and meals and the changing seasons visible through cottage windows. In December 1961, Joseph P. Kennedy suffered a massive stroke while playing golf at his Palm Beach estate. The stroke is severe, leaving him partially paralyzed and unable to speak coherently. The man who controlled his family's fortunes and fates with iron certainty is reduced to frustrated gestures and incomprehensible sounds. an irony not lost on those who know what he authorized done to his daughter 20 years earlier. It is only after Joseph's stroke, when he can no longer control information or enforce silence, that Rosemary's siblings finally learn the full truth of her condition and her whereabouts. The younger children, Bobby, Teddy, Jean, Patricia, had been told almost nothing during their childhoods. Even Eunice and Kathleen, who were closer to Rosemary in age, knew only that she had been sent away for treatment and was now living in an institution in Wisconsin. Now, with their father incapacitated and their mother finally willing to acknowledge what happened, the Kennedy siblings begin to visit St. Coletta. The visits are initially awkward, tentative. They arrive at the Kennedy cottage to find a middle-aged woman with a childlike demeanor, her speech limited to simple phrases and fragments, her movements uncoordinated. It takes time to reconcile this person with their memories of a sister who once danced at embassy balls and was presented to the King and Queen of England. But they come. Eunice, in particular, begins visiting regularly, bringing her own children to meet their aunt. Rosemary is occasionally brought to family homes in Florida and on Cape Cod, though these visits require careful planning and the constant attendance of nurses from St. Coletta. By this time, Rosemary has relearned certain basic skills through patient work by the Franciscan sisters. She can walk, though with a pronounced limp and requiring an arm to lean on. She can feed herself, though messily. She can recognize family members and respond to her name. She smiles readily and seems to enjoy attention and affection. What she cannot do is explain what happened to her, remember her life before the surgery in any coherent way, or express complex thoughts or feelings. The woman who once kept a diary listing, dances and dress fittings is gone, replaced by someone whose inner life remains fundamentally inaccessible to those around her. Eunice Kennedy Shriver's response to confronting the reality of her sister's condition is to deepen her involvement with people with intellectual disabilities. In many ways, this becomes her life's work, the cause that defines her legacy more than any other Kennedy endeavor. In the early 1960s, she began hosting summer camps for children and adults with intellectual disabilities at her home in Maryland, inviting them to swim in her pool, play sports on her lawn, and experience the kind of casual inclusion that institutions rarely provide. The camps are chaotic, joyful, transformative for participants who have spent their lives being hidden and underestimated. These camps evolve into a larger vision. In 1968, Eunice helped found the Special Olympics, an organized athletic competition specifically designed for people with intellectual disabilities. The first International Special Olympics Games were held at Soldier Field in Chicago, with about 1,000 athletes from the United States and Canada competing in track and field and swimming events. The philosophy behind the Special Olympics is radically different from the instinct toward concealment that shaped Rosemary's life. Instead of hiding disability, the Games celebrate what people with intellectual disabilities can do. Instead of managing appearances, they create spaces where difference is not merely tolerated but honored. Instead of silence and institutionalization, they offer visibility and community. Eunice is careful in her public statements about Special Olympics not to make the founding explicitly about Rosemary. She speaks in more general terms about the need for inclusion, about the capabilities of people who have been systematically underestimated. Yet she also acknowledges, when asked directly, that her sister's experience is part of what drives her work. In a 1962 article for the Saturday Evening Post titled Hope for Retarded Children, Eunice publicly reveals for the first time that the Kennedy family has a daughter with intellectual disabilities. The article is carefully written, emphasizing hope and progress rather than tragedy, but it breaks decades of silence. Rosemary's existence, previously erased from family narratives, is now acknowledged. The narrator reflects that grace, in Eunice's work, shifts registers entirely. Where once grace meant the polished manners of drawing rooms, the perfect execution of curtsies and thank you notes, the seamless performance of social competence, it now comes to mean something different: the dignity of participation, the worth of every person regardless of ability, the moral necessity of inclusion rather than concealment. The family, forced by Joseph's stroke and their own evolving understanding to confront the consequences of secrecy and shame begins to craft a different kind of public example. They become, over time, advocates rather than concealers. Special Olympics grew into an international movement, eventually serving millions of athletes in hundreds of countries. But this transformation cannot undo what was done to Rosemary. The lobotomy is irreversible. The decades she spent hidden away cannot be recovered. The life she might have lived, limited though it would have been by her learning differences, was stolen from her by a father who chose expedience over patience, control over acceptance. As the Kennedy siblings age and begin writing memoirs and giving interviews, more details about Rosemary emerge. Eunice speaks carefully but honestly about her sister's condition. Ted Kennedy, in his autobiography, expresses regret and acknowledges the family's failure. Even the Kennedy Library and Museum eventually creates exhibits that include Rosemary's story, complete with photographs and diary excerpts that show her as she was before the surgery, smiling, eager, doing her best. The emergence of this narrative serves multiple purposes. It humanizes the Kennedy family, making them sympathetic figures who experience private tragedy alongside their public triumphs. It positions Eunice's advocacy work as redemptive, a way of transforming personal suffering into social good. And it, perhaps, offers a form of posthumous justice to Rosemary herself, whose voice was silenced, but whose story finally becomes part of the historical record. Yet the narrator notes that there is something complicated about this redemption narrative. The Special Olympics is genuinely transformative, genuinely important, but it cannot erase the fact that Rosemary's family chose surgery over acceptance, concealment over accommodation, their political ambitions over her well-being. Rosemary's name, once carefully omitted from society pages and campaign literature, begins to appear in a new context in the 1960s and beyond. Not as an ornament to family prestige, not as a problem to be managed, but as a reason for advocacy, a symbol of what happens when disability is met with shame instead of support. The transformation is real, but it comes decades too late for Rosemary herself, who remains in Jefferson, Wisconsin, cared for by nuns, living a life unimaginably smaller than what even her limited capacities might have allowed. Rosemary Kennedy died on 7 January 2005 at Fort Memorial Hospital in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin, at the age of 86. Several of her siblings are at her bedside: Jean Kennedy Smith, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, Patricia Kennedy Lawford, and Ted Kennedy. They have flown to Wisconsin when word comes that she is failing, finally present for her as they were not for so many decades of her life. By 2005, the outline of Rosemary's story was public knowledge. Eunice's 1962 article broke the initial silence. Doris Kearns Goodwin's 1987 book, The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, discussed lobotomy openly, based on interviews with family members and research in medical archives. Later biographies by Lawrence Leamer, Ronald Kessler, and Kate Clifford Larson provided even more detailed accounts, including the horrifying details of the surgery itself. The fact that Joseph Kennedy authorized a lobotomy on his daughter, that the procedure destroyed her cognition and personality, that she spent most of her life hidden in institutions, all of this has been documented, debated, and analyzed. Rosemary is no longer a secret, but a symbol. Her story invoked in discussions of disability rights, medical ethics, women's autonomy, and family dysfunction. In the years and decades following her death, archives continue to gather the material artifacts of her life. The John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum in Boston maintains extensive Kennedy family papers, including Rose's diaries, family correspondence, and photographs documenting Rosemary's childhood and young adulthood. Among these archives are diary fragments from the late 1930s, preserved in Rosemary's own handwriting. Went to the ballet in the evening, had tea with Mother and Kick, wore my new pink dress. The entries are brief, enthusiastic, focused on surfaces. They reveal a young woman who experienced pleasure, who wanted to participate in the social world around her, who recorded her days with earnest attention. Also preserved are photographs: Rosemary as a child on Cape Cod beaches, smiling in a white dress; Rosemary as a teenager at the convent school, standing with classmates. Rosemary at 18 in formal presentation attire, preparing for her court debut. Rosemary in the Pathé newsreel footage from May 1938, moving gracefully beside her mother and sister. The archives include letters she wrote and letters written about her. Thank you notes copied out in careful script, teachers' reports to Rose and Joseph, medical consultations, the correspondence between Joseph Kennedy and Walter Freeman that preceded the surgery. In recent decades, the Kennedy family home on Beale Street in Brookline has become a National Historic Site, operated by the National Park Service. Tours of the house include Rosemary's story as part of the broader Kennedy narrative. Visitors see the nursery where she was born, the dining room where she practiced her letters, family photographs that show her included among her siblings. The John F. Kennedy Presidential Library has mounted exhibits that explicitly address Rosemary's life and the family's eventual advocacy for people with disabilities. Display cases show her diary pages, her court presentation photographs, and contextual materials explaining intellectual disability, lobotomy, and the evolution of disability rights in America. One particular document appears frequently in these exhibits, quoted in biographies and discussed in documentaries. A statement from one of Rosemary's letters or diary entries that reads, "I have always had serious tastes and understand life is not given to us just for enjoyment." The line suggests a self-awareness, a philosophical inclination that complicates easy assumptions about her capabilities and inner life. The Kennedy family has cooperated, to varying degrees, with this archival and educational work. Eunice, before her death in 2009, spoke openly about her sister and about how Rosemary's experience shaped the Special Olympics. Ted Kennedy wrote about Rosemary in his memoir. Even the Kennedy Foundation now includes disability advocacy as a major focus of its grant-making. The final scene returns to the opening portrait. We are back in a museum or archive, looking at the photograph of Rosemary Kennedy in her white presentation gown and long gloves, preparing to curtsy before King George VI and Queen Elizabeth on that May evening in 1938. The photograph is now displayed behind glass, its silver gelatin print showing the subtle deterioration of age, slight fading, foxing at the edges. Museum lighting illuminates it carefully, avoiding the kind of harsh overhead glare that filled the surgical theater where her life was destroyed 3 years after this image was captured. The photograph is flanked by other artifacts, her diary page listing the court presentation among opera outings and dress fittings, an example of her thank you note handwriting, a brief explanatory text panel that summarizes her life with clinical precision: birth, education, surgery, institutionalization, death. Nearby, in another display case, lies a page from one of her letters or diaries, the paper yellowed, but the ink still clear. Her careful, childlike script forming the expected phrases of gratitude and pleasure, each letter deliberately shaped, evidence of years of patient instruction. The gloves, the script, the curtsy, once tools of performance, once instruments in an elaborate family strategy to make Rosemary appear seamlessly normal, they are now evidence in a very different kind of narrative. They speak to what was demanded of her, what was done to her, what was lost. Elegance remains in these artifacts, the beauty of the gown, the precision of her penmanship, the formal grace of the court photograph, but the elegance is now inseparable from its cost. The exhausting effort of constant performance, the terror of nighttime escapes from convent schools, the surgery that was supposed to help her and instead destroyed her, the decades of institutional isolation. A visitor to the Kennedy Library leans over the display case, reading Rosemary's handwriting in silence. The museum is quiet this afternoon, just the soft shuffle of other visitors' feet on polished floors, the distant murmur of a tour guide explaining something in another gallery, the subtle hum of climate control systems protecting these fragile documents from further decay. The visitor reads the thank you note. "Dear Mrs. Winthrop, thank you so much for the lovely afternoon," and tries to imagine the girl who wrote it, the hand guided by a mother's corrections, the hours of practice required to make each letter acceptably neat. The room is quiet enough to hear the faint rustle of conditioned museum air moving through vents, the soft electronic beep of a security system, the almost imperceptible creak of the building settling. And beneath those sounds, if one listens carefully enough, if one pays attention to what the artifacts actually reveal rather than what the redemptive narrative suggests, there is an unspoken question. How many lives were shaped and broken and hidden away to keep everything looking perfectly in place? How many young women were taught that grace meant silence, that refinement meant self-erasure, that family loyalty required the sacrifice of individual selfhood? The artifacts cannot answer. They can only display themselves, beautiful and terrible, perfectly preserved evidence of a world that demanded perfection and destroyed anyone who could not provide it.